As we all know, we live in an API-driven world, and you need APIs to expose your services to your customers. But if you're building APIs today, you're probably juggling with 5 different tools, one for design, another for testing, something else for documentation, and now there is a nice AI agent sitting in the corner trying to help or distract you. The fact is, things are getting better, but it is still a fragmented mess and it slows teams down. What if AI wasn't just in the tool in your stack, it was woven directly into every step of your API workflow, from design to development? That's exactly what Postman just rebuilt from the ground up. And today we have with us Balaji Raghavan, head of engineering at Postman, to discuss how they re-architected their entire platform to make AI a native part of every API workflow. Balaji, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you, Swapnil. It's great to be here.
It's my pleasure. First of all, I think this is the first time you and I are talking. So I would like to quickly introduce our audience. What is Postman all about? Because you folks have been around for years, millions of developers, they use, Postman. So let's just do this quick background and then we'll talk about why you folks are building the core platform.
So, talking about Postman itself, Postman has been a software, API development product for over a decade at this point. So, over the years, I think about more than 40 million developers have used the product. And we continue to be the go-to product for API development, testing, and monitoring. So as an end-to-end platform that helps you manage your APIs, we make sure that as you're deploying your software, you are able to deploy that safely without breaking changes impacting your customers. So that's been our mission. We continue to kind of operate in that mission. But with changes that's happening with AI, we want to make sure we are making it easier, not harder, for you to be able to do that as you transition from just services talking to each other to also agents talking to each other.
Yeah, once again, that's where we are heading. So let's talk about the core platform and what drove to rebuild it after such a long time.
When you think about the core platform itself, we do have capability for you to explore APIs, start building your software, then to test APIs. After you have tested those APIs, converge that into your CI/CD systems so that you don't have to do this manually. It's automatically happening as you evolve those APIs. And then we have the Insights product, which enables you to monitor the APIs in production and identify and reproduce any issues that you see with those APIs. So we had these disparate components, but what we also started seeing in the software lifecycle itself is that, when somebody is working with the APIs, at that time, the exploration process now can be done much faster with your AI tools. So rather than actually embedding just the AI tools into the software, we said we have to go back and think about our own APIs from an AI readiness perspective, start building the platform from the ground up, and try to bring that native experience of using AI for doing development, where with MCP servers that you have with other APIs that you're working with, you can just embed into Postman and utilize that for being able to develop your APIs and test APIs. So that's where we started. But as we started working on it, one of the core things we realized is engineers really want to kind of operate in their local development environment. So when we talk about designing these APIs, it has to be in a native Git workflow where they are working locally, not in the cloud. So that was a aha moment when we started building our agent mode, that we recognized we have to bring it natively to the user's development environment, not push it continuously in the cloud. So we started evolving the product in that direction, and now we have a end-to-end workflow where the development cycle happens locally on the Git workflow. In addition to it, agent mode helps you kind of bridge from that to the testing. And agent mode acts as this native agent that understands your code base as well as your specs, understands your other API artifacts such as docs, etc., and keeps that in sync with all the changes you're making locally. So this was like, agents can do 3 or 4 things, 5 things all in parallel rather than what humans used to do one at a time. So we evolved our AI native platform to actually like catch up with that.
Talk a bit about, is it more about adding AI features, or is it also, as you mentioned, that the way we write software, the way and where we develop software is also kind of changing? So what was the main idea behind re-architecting the platform? Was it mostly AI, or it's also how the developers workflow is changing? That's why. And if possible, what does it actually mean for developers? And if, once again, there are 4 or 5 questions, sorry about that, if you can also talk about what has actually changed under the hood. So basically, was it AI, or was it how developers write things? What mean for developer now, and what has changed under the hood?
So I think when it like, I'll address all of those questions independently. So first, like, talking about the developer habits itself, like, developers want to focus on like, critical things that only they can do, and like, the things that like AI cannot do for them. So as we think about that, mundane things like writing your unit test, creating an API spec, like, creating mocks for your APIs. These are things where we should not necessarily have the developer want to actually click through things and help, like, automate many of those things through our agent itself. So we kind of like started with that and said, like, let's help the developer get rid of like mundane tasks that they have to do. And you can actually do it with a copilot, which I think, like, can help you just do those mundane tasks. But if you build it more natively into the product itself, then, like, to achieve that outcome, you have to change the product. What we do think about in terms of API readiness for AI, like, most of the APIs that are designed today are not like, ready for being a immediate consumption with for LLMs. So as a result, you have to evolve the APIs that you have built your own product on to also be able to kind of like, become context aware and enable the LLMs to be able to kind of like operate against them without having to like refer to large amounts of data and specs, because you want the operation to be spiffy. So as a result, a core thing that we changed within the product is to move away from like the massive collection JSON object for like, describing all of your APIs down to a YAML format, which is also diffable as well as consumable by the LLMs. So when in your Git-native workflow, you are actually looking at the changes that have happened to a single API, you can actually do that much more efficiently because in YAML than like, this large object. It also helps the LLM have context on only the area of change in the API that you're working with, rather than getting confused with all the APIs that's present in your workspace and like, sometimes hallucinate into operating against that. So that's why the copilot can only be more effective when you change the core, like, APIs and the data model within your product itself. So we started with that. The second part of it is like, when we do that, naturally like the native Git workflows start to operate, which means to make that work, you had to migrate a lot of the content which we kept in the cloud, including the specs, including like the docs, like all of these content we had to start storing into the code repo itself, so that you know that like when you make changes to the code, the corresponding artifacts are also up to date. So this gives you a versioned view of all the API artifacts which previously didn't exist in correlation with your code. So this like, evolution of Postman helps you kind of like, see all API artifacts as one single unit, and that makes LLMs more efficient to operate with, like, all these artifacts as like your API artifacts, which helps you kind of like, prevent breaking changes. Whenever you have customers depending on your APIs, you want to make sure the spec they are working against is like pretty much up to date with your code. And today, like, you have to do that by resharing your specs either over email, through Confluence docs, through SharePoint, wherever else. And that's an inefficient way to do it. If it's along with your code and you published it, then in that case, it becomes much easier for them to consume. So we changed towards that. And I think, like, these changes have really helped. The other part we also had quickly realized is when you think about API maturity, The tech leads and the managers within the org have no visibility into what's the maturity of your APIs today. And so as a result, to fill that gap, we created an API catalog, which allows you to now see the evolution of that API from its development stages to testing stages to production insights. And then now you can start measuring for your critical APIs, how mature are they? Have you actually got specs that are conformant to your API style guides? All the governance rules you want to apply on those APIs, are they being executed every single time that you're actually making changes to those APIs? So we've now codified it and brought it into the product itself through our API catalog, which helps also the leaders within the organization make get visibility into the maturity of the APIs, as well as any changes that's happening with it that needs attention.
Thank you. And when we're listening to you, I also want to, if possible, uh, so folks can visualize when we look at workflow. You did touch upon that. Where exactly does AI show up now in the workflow in developers pipeline? Is it in design, testing, documentation, or no matter what they do, it's everywhere?
It's literally everywhere, because we are our own first customers, right? When I look at my own engineering team, at Postman, we call ourselves the customer zero. So everything we are building, is because we see the inefficiency in how we were operating. And as a result, when you think about Postman MCP server integrated into your let's say cursor IDE. So when you are starting to write code, if you invoke the Postman MCP to actually design your API, and then use cursor to write the rest of the code associated with it, we've seen that the maturity of the product is significantly higher than if you try to do it without the Postman MCP server. Because we do believe in starting with an API first design principle, and many a times if you directly jump to code, it's the way that junior engineers would do it. But using something like a Postman MCP server basically moves the needle a little higher and make sure that you're operating more like a senior engineer who's actually taking into consideration how systems work with each other, the architecture itself, codify it, and then write the code associated with it. So we are seeing benefits of what we have deployed now, enabling engineers to operate with higher maturity in the design phase. Then in addition to it, with tools like the catalog, you also are able to see through that execution through the testing, as well as the CI/CD phase, as well as production stages. Now, the other fact we also saw is testing, as an engineer, I can tell you testing is one of the most boring parts of the job itself. You want to deploy features more often, and testing gets in the way of your velocity in some ways. That's how an engineer would feel. But if you actually see for enterprises, it's very important that the systems that you're building, you have tested it out to ensure that it's actually going to work as intended in the spec before you deploy it. So, but engineers always take the shortcut of skipping some part of testing, limited coverage, etc. So we take that boring part away, and we do see that engineers are writing their unit tests, their load tests, their smoke test, everything through AI now. And so now they can do that natively through agent mode as well. So development, testing, deploy, everything is happening with AI. I do believe that AI is an enabler for engineers at this point to actually do more things in parallel, as you said. Multitasking isn't really a human skill, although we do all claim that we can do it. But AI can do it much better than us, and so it helps us really multitask when and complement our skill sets in being able to do the critical thinking job that we do.
What I do appreciate that these days, a lot of companies, they will just glue or bolt AI assistant into existing tools, and then they just put AI label on almost everything. But I think, I mean, I don't know internally how you folks were working, but I think you especially did not do that. You actually embed AI tools natively by reworking the whole platform. Talk a bit about what was the reason for that decision, and how does it really impact the workflow performance, time it takes for developer, cost. There are so many factors that which impact. So if you can, and you also mentioned that you dog food or you use until your customer zero, so you already know those pain points. So if there are benefits, you are reaping those benefits yourself as well. So, but I do want to understand this aspect. Why did you approach it in this manner, and how does it really affect developers' day-to-day life?
I mean, when you think about like the use of AI itself, I know given my prior experiences as well, when you try to kind of like just change like a part of your workflow to be AI, you don't kind of like reap the full benefit of like what AI can do for you. So when we think about like, just a copilot, take one use case at a time and like, make the copilot solve for it, that would have been the most inefficient way to bring this product to market. So instead, like, looking at all the core journeys and having like, a redesign of execution on those journeys in the backend to ensure that like, an agent can now operate against a cleaner set of APIs, which are fully descriptive in natural language to enable like, the LLMs to operate against. That was like, one of the first principles that we followed. The second one that I actually am like even more proud of is the fact that we decided any new feature we build, we want to make sure agent mode, which is our agent, can actually like operate against first before it's available in the UI itself. So even before a human can operate against that particular capability, we want the agent mode to be able to operate against that capability. So it's again like this, like, AI first thinking, where we say that like, let's not bolt on AI after the fact. It's like, we build the capability for AI to operate first, and only when AI can operate against it, we build a UI for humans to also be able to do that. So that's another core area that we invested heavily in. And now, like, almost everything we bring into Postman starts with like availability in agent mode. And then, like, we involve designers to say now where in the UI can the user actually like pull this into their workflow. This does mean that like, the agent sometimes is doing some background operations. And as a result, like, when you think about long running tasks, background execution, background agents running for a little while and coming back and validating with you whether they should continue with certain steps, you have to solve for all of those problems. And like, those are all the cool things that are present in the infrastructure that we've actually like modernized. Now we are starting to build the UI for some of those capabilities to come back into the product. And so in the upcoming few months, you will continue to see some of these like capabilities that completely differentiate how you think about like your execution process, where you don't need to see everything in your UI. You can just delegate into a background agent to operate against certain things, and then like have the UI for being able to see how all your background agents are operating. So that's something that like we'll continue to evolve towards.
I mean, you, as you mentioned, there are already millions of developers on Postman. Uh, what kind of feedback loop is there where before the whole re-architecting help happened, or after that, where you're also, I mean, of course you mentioned you internally are using, but uh, what role did the market, external developers feedback play into this development?
I mean, we launched a early version, like alpha version of agent mode to our developers much earlier than this V12 release. So it did give us like ability to understand what workflows mattered most to them, find like anything that was not working yet because of the backend APIs not being supportive of how LLMs wanted to kind of like make modifications, say, to a collection. So we identified specific issues of like certain APIs not being conformant to make LLMs decipher exactly how to operate against, and like made those changes by getting that validation from developer usage itself. So we didn't just like build it in a closed box. It was like completely transparent, onboarded a bunch of users. We saw to like token consumption of like certain operations, looking at the fact that like the collection object being extremely large in certain cases, resulting in like blowing out your total like token consumption. How do we reduce that? How do we make sure like our data model conforms to a way where the user can operate on smaller entities? So all of these things was through learning based off of like users usage. And given our developer base, Like, they are very generous with their, with their feedback in making sure that like the product is continuing to evolve. And given that love that we get from our developer base, where they actually like continuously provide both inputs as well as kudos to us, it just encourages us to do the right things with them.
In addition to making developers' life easier, what about the amount? I mean, as I said, we live in an API-driven world. The teams are managing large-scale API ecosystems, hundreds and thousands of endpoints. How does native AI, how does this weaving, embedding helps at a scale as well?
I mean, I'm glad you asked this question because when I look at like, our API catalog, I just mentioned it gives me the ability now to see all of my endpoints that are running in production, like, hundreds of microservices that we have at Postman. I have like, hundreds of APIs that like, they are exposing. They're all now visible through a single pane of glass. But the best part is agent mode operates on the catalog as well. And like, in the catalog, I can see for each one of the code base to like, the production endpoints that code, like, that code is deployed in. I can see that full like, journey and have the agent mode help me, like, if something is wrong in production, help me identify what changed in that code that is actually like, resulting in that particular outage. So agent mode is not only operating on the API artifacts, it also operates on the API catalog, which helps me kind of like, make sure that like you're still thinking AI first, not only for like creation and testing of like your APIs, but also for a management of your APIs, for being able to say that like, if both proactively as well as reactively, if you want to make changes to APIs, those are all happening through agents, not necessarily through like, humans having to go and like click and like, look at logs and things like that. Agent can bring the right logs to you. Based on that, you can actually like, validate some of the assumptions it's making, and then go and allow it to make those changes that like, enable you to move much faster in addressing, say, a production issue that you might be encountering. So these are things like, now are enabling not only the developers, but also the managers of the teams to actually like operate very independently and like, don't have to have status reports coming from the teams. We can actually like go and look at it in the catalog and like recognize every CI run that had failed, every single like, deployment that is like in progress, which versions of like which APIs are running in which environments. All of these things is visible through that pane. And then agent is there to help us like, make sure if we see an anomaly, we can go and address it.
Where are we heading? Is this the foundation for more AI native workflows? Is it a response to what is happening in the market? Or this is the final form unless something big, maybe quantum computer will come?
I would say like, evolution continues to happen. This was a like, a big leap of like, evolution that just happened. Like, cloud was a big leap. Now AI is a even bigger leap that's enabling just like, change of developer workflows. Quantum could be the next big leap, which actually like, enables us to do more things in parallel, just like, have a much larger context of like things to operate against. But some fundamental problems continue to still exist, which is like, how do we manage memory? Because like, every operation in isolation, like, is you can operate with like, knowledge that you have about that, or you can tap into the knowledge that was available from prior instances. Like, when to use that memory, when not to use that memory is still a problem that is like, research oriented, and we need to continue to solve. Even if the technology improves, some of these fundamental things that we've always worked with in terms of like, creating context still holds true, and we need engineering to actually like focus on those harder problems and solve for that. While like, mundane things that we do every day, like, I always say this simple thing in my personal job, like, I need that like, stimulation for at least 50% of the time that I'm actually like working, and that mental stimulation to actually like solve hard problems. If you start losing it, then in that case you almost become just a button pusher, and anything that I'm doing just button pushing for, I would rather have an agent built to actually like do all the button pushing and summarize, and like let me make just the decision, like critical thinking around what I can like and what I need to provide additional value towards. So when it comes to performance reviews, for example, for me, like I would rather have like an agent actually like take all the inputs from the quarter to actually like summarize for me, and then I can actually like use that. So similarly, in the developer's workflow, everything that they can't pay attention on a continuous basis, which is like production systems, like changes in dependency trees, all of these things, I don't want them to continuously like go and check and on dashboards and in code bases. Like the tools need to AI needs to be able to do that for them, and they can focus on the incremental tasks they are working on, which actually requires critical thinking and like solving for that. So I do think AI is an enabler for that. Quantum will just make it much faster to be able to do that. And for all we know, like you might not even need to have the technical skill to solve these problems in the future. Anybody, like even say my mom can say I need an app for solving this problem, and like AI goes and builds it for them. So that would be the like ideal end result that we would want to work towards. But you know if that does happen, the good thing is engineers will be building those tools for my mom to be able to do that. And so that critical thinking of like what memory is needed, what context is needed so that she's able to do that is something I would like be encouraged as an engineer to want to go and solve for.
Balaji, thank you so much for joining me. After listening to you, and you explain things in such a beautiful manner, uh, people will realize that embedding AI directly into every layer of the AI API workflow instead of bolting them or treating it as a secondary or side assistant, that's the fundamental shift how developer tools should be built or are being built. Thank you so much for walking through Postman's re-architecture and what it means for developers, because that's what really matter. Managing complex API ecosystem, large scale deployment. Thank you so much for all those insights, and I look forward to chat with you folks again. Thank you.
Thank you, Swapnil, for having me on TFI.